I consider it a privilege to have been, over the past few years that I've been retired, to have a second career, more or less, and that's really been a privilege for me, and it's a privilege to talk about some of the things that we've done on Arizona. Just to give you a little background, these co-authors constitute a research group that has been put together. Various people have specialties in metallurgical engineering and corrosion and chemistry and things like analysis of materials. And then the last person on the end there is Dr. Dave Conlon. He's chief of the Submerged Resources Center of the National Park Service, located in Lakewood. And so I've been working with these people for all these many years, since 1999 and 2000, in that time frame. So it's been a wonderful collaboration with Dr. Conlon and his group. When I and my wife went out to Pearl Harbor in 1998 for one of our wedding anniversaries, when we were there, we had an introduction, a letter of introduction to the Superintendent Kathy Billings, and at that time they were looking for someone to do some research on the Arizona, what the state of the metal was at that time. So I felt very fortunate that we were there at the right time, and I was able to put together a research group from the University of Nebraska and from other locations, and so we've been together ever since. One of these people is one of my former students, and I think it's been really wonderful to associate with former students who in fact tell me what to do instead of me telling them now. So it kind of works both ways, but it's been a wonderful association, and it continues. So before I get to talking a little too much here, I want to go ahead and present some of the material. Of course, this is the ship as it existed just before the attack, and the ship had gone through quite a bit of reconstruction in 1929 to 31. They'd put what are called torpedo blisters on the outside, which is this wide open space with the outside of the wall had been extended so that there was a void space between the original hull and the outside of the structure. We call those torpedo blisters, and it turns out the idea was that they would protect the ship during a torpedo impact, but we found that the fact that there were these blisters on the outside helped to protect the interior of the ship itself. Just because there's that space between the two, between the original hull and the outside of the torpedo blister, is about 2.5, 3 feet. But it's all full of mud, and it's very inactive, not much oxygen there, so it protects the inner wall. You notice the cage mass, let's see, I don't know whether I can, yeah, cage mass, like, anyway, they're the vertical members that are on that side. And there's a picture here of the ship, and that may come up in a moment, which you see what are called cage mass, and so that was the difference in structure at that time. And you can see on this one there are these were cables that were structured so that the mass were held in place in a cable type structure, and that had been changed then to these metal more or less tubes, you might say, that are quite sturdy and strong. So there were quite a few improvements made at the time in 1929 to 31. The project domains, of which there were several, corrosion was the one I'm involved in, environmental monitoring around the ship, of course structural monitoring with GPS, in other words setting up a GPS and then seeing how are things shifting around, and there have been very little of that. Geological analysis, what is the structure of the geologic structure underneath the ship? So how does that then impact the stability of the ship? So they were concerned about that. oil analysis I'll talk a little bit about, and microbiology. So those are the other areas which have a secondary impact on the work we were doing. Of course, this is the typical picture we've seen many times just before the attack with the Arizona. The Vestal is the first ship. I think that's the Vestal is the ship out on that end, and then the Arizona and the, well, that's the Nevada, Arizona, and then the Vestal next to it. It's interesting that last night on one of the channels I saw it was an invitation to I guess it was 3 of the 5 survivors that are still living that were on the ship during the attack, and one of those was Don Stratton. I've met him several times, but he was invited to Pearl Harbor, or he was invited to the White House, and this was on the television yesterday, so I thought that was kind of interesting that Don and 2 of his other cohorts were there at that time, just yesterday. You'll see that in the upper part of that picture then is Hickam Field just being bombed, but that's just before the attack and the bomb which detonated on Arizona. This, of course, is the enhanced photograph of the explosion on Arizona because of the fact that the ship had been struck 2 or 3 times with other bombs, but it was impacted by one bomb that detonated the munitions, and of course that's what caused the huge explosion and the damage in the forepart of the ship, which I'll show you a little bit later. So this is an enhanced photograph apparently from what had been originally photographed, so it was kind of a revealing to see bits and pieces of parts of the ship and so on had been blown into the air. A huge explosion that we think we've found evidence of that, and I'm going to show you that a little bit later. This is after the attack, of course, on the ship and in Battleship Row, and you can see the oil distributing out from the ships at that time, and that's what caused so much trouble and difficulty in recovery at that time. This happens to be divers that were employed to go into the Arizona after the attack, and the purpose was to see what damage had occurred and to see where maybe the structure might have been impacted internally, and the other thought was, of course, the recovery of bodies that had been trapped inside the ship during the explosion. They soon found that that was not practical. They were unable to do much more with that, and that's when the Navy declared it as a memorial, and there was to be no more entry of anyone into the ship. So no divers have been into the interior of the ship. Any entry into the ship has been by remote operating vehicle, and that's what we have conducted. This is one of our field operations. This one was in 2004. We started with the first field operation in 2001, and by 2004 the Park Service had obtained a remote operating vehicle which then made entry into some of the portholes and into some of the offices and other compartments in the ship. Well, this is the ROV was small enough they could go through a porthole, and then it was mounted with oxygen probe and a pH probe and other things, so we could take some measurements on the interior of the ship. This happens to be a photograph of the captain's desk in the captain's department, and you'll see to the right is the evidence of a sink. So this was just the beginning of this. A lot more has been done with remote operating vehicles. I think there was quite a presentation this past 75th anniversary on December 7th about additional entry into the ship, and they've been able to go down into the second deck. At the time that this was done, It was only in the corridors just adjacent to the portholes themselves. Oil sampling has been an important part of the research that the Park Service has been involved in. Of course, oil rises, of course, because it's lighter than water, so it ends up rising to the surface. And this probe that's being held in his hand there on that side, right in there, is a longer probe which he sticks up into the top of the compartment so that the oil is trapped in the top of the compartment. He put the probe up in there and collected some oil and then pulled it out, and then they've taken a sample that's collected in this vial and analyzed that. So this is some analysis of the results. And the key thing we notice here is that the oil that came from bunkers originally, in other words, it came out of a bunker and it was analyzed, still contains some of the volatiles. You see some of those pips represent some of the volatile components in the oil, whereas oil that was just trapped in an overhead and had been there for a long time, had lost some of its volatiles in the oil. So there was a way to identify where the source of oil was coming from. So some of it came from compartments that had collected oil during the attack and had been there for 45, 50 years, as opposed to oil which came right out of a bunker. So that's been a helpful way to ascertain what's going on. As far as the oil is concerned, the question I was talking about this earlier, the oil is still leaking at the rate perhaps of maybe 2 to 3, maybe 4 quarts a day. I think it's variable. Any of you that have been on the memorial, and you can watch the oil bubbles come up and then they spread on the surface, particularly on a calm day. But that amount of oil has not been a concern to the Park Service. What is of concern are any major breakdowns that occur on the structure itself. So that's coming. One of the ways we identify where we are on the ship are the frame numbers. This is the original construction. You see these frames are 4 feet apart. There's 150 of those frames, so the ship was about 600 feet long, and I think 105 maximum width. And it made 7 transits through the Panama Canal, so the width of the ship was, and any other ship, of course, at that time, was limited by the availability of, getting through the Panama Canal. Well, the corrosion research really got going in 2000, supported by the Department of Defense Legacy Fund, and that fund provided the necessary monies to conduct our field operations for about 4 years. This happens to be 2 of my group from the University of Nebraska, and the person in the center is the present historian at the Arizona Memorial, and the work that I've done then, primarily I've never had a chance to dive on the ship, although they promised me before this project was over they'd get me down there some way or another, but that just never seemed to develop. So I've been on the surface, and there'd be 3 or 4 divers down on the ship doing various things like drilling or giving me reporting on locations where they were, and I would record the data. So we collected a huge amount of data over a period of that time, which we've since reduced and utilized to some extent. Well, I want to go back to this one. This happens to be probably one of the most important things that we did during our time on the ship, and that was to obtain hull coupons. In other words, the idea was to take and I've got a picture of the hole saw, that they would actually drill a hole right through the hull of the ship, and they would collect what's called concretion. That is a biofouling that develops on the ship over time, marine inorganic material which accumulates on the outside and as well as on the inside. So we took a core sample of this. The core is about 3 inches in diameter. We took 8 core samples that were obtained through the assistance of the, this is the a dive unit that's part of the U.S. Navy, as well as a company called Titan Marine Industries, which designed a device where they could actually fix the drill to the hull and obtain those samples. So that was kind of a special thing. We consider those to be moon rocks because we're never going to be able to get any more samples than the 8 that we obtained at that time. And this kind of shows a picture of the cross section of the ship, and this is probably the most important photograph that we've had showing where we took the samples. The samples are shown by those lines, and the one sample we took at the very top, right at the water's surface or near it, within about a foot or two of the water surface, we can see that there's concretion developed on both sides, and then in the center is the metal itself. So we can see that at the surface the corrosion is occurring from both sides because it's exposed on both sides up at the top. And when we go down here to the other side of the ship on the starboard side, you notice that the metal piece is almost totally intact. In other words, if you go down 30 feet just below the mud line, there's virtually no corrosion. There is some, but it's very low. So the biggest problem is that we see severe degradation right at the surface because the corrosion can occur from both sides. But if we go down to depth and the oxygen level is lower and the concretion then acts as a protector. In other words, it keeps the oxygen limited on the surface of the ship, and that's what's important. And so these are just samples of the concretion. And again, the metal on one side is much more extensive than it is on the other side where it had been up near the surface. Well, that's the hole saw, and you can see the metal, the hole saw on the right-hand side, and then the metal right here on the left with the concretion in between. It turns out that that concretion has been a very important part of our research, and really something that's been unique on Arizona. And so I want to be talking a little bit more about that as we go along. But these are the 4 cross sections, and this happened to be just on one side of the ship. You can see that the bright part at the top at 5 feet, there's quite a bit of corrosion. But as we go down to 34 feet on the right side, the metal is pretty much intact. You see, that's the interior side of the hull, and there's virtually no corrosion. And then there's a little rough on the outside surface next to the concretion. Now we go to this slide, and it kind of shows what's happened here at the surface. Now the total length, the total distance on that top one goes out to 5/10 of an inch, so that the original thickness of the hull right at the top was about half an inch. And then you see the dark area represents the amount of metal that was lost. And so we go down to 15 feet, so the water depth is on the left side, and the original plate thickness is on the right. So on the right side at 15 feet, the hull thickness is about 7/8 of an inch. And as we get to lower depths, 22 feet, the maximum thickness is 5/10 and subsequently 3/4 of an inch. But you can see the amount of metal lost as of 2002 is quite minimal. And that's been an important thing. Thank you. So that's been important to us in realizing what's really happening on the ship, because this concretion is really just acting as a barrier. And it has a lot to do with the modeling that we've done since that time. That's a piece of the concretion that we have analyzed, and it runs about, it can run anywhere up to an inch thick, depends on where you are on the metal. And this happens to be an analysis of this concretion, and I won't expect you to be concerned about this whole table, but I would like you to see on the third column from the right is the iron content. And you see iron contents. Let's see if I can get this. Anyway, if you look at the column on the extreme right, the third from the right, iron contents are averaging about 50%. So what's happening is that the iron that goes into solution in the steel then is collected by the concretion. And so what we have developed a technique where we can analyze the iron that's in the concretion and then from that work backwards and determine how much metal is lost with some correction. So that's been really an interesting aspect of our work because we want to be able to analyze the condition of a ship based on non-invasive techniques if we can. In other words, we can't go into a lot of these structures, which I'll point out later, and expect to take out a core sample. It's just too much to expect to have the equipment to do that. That's a major undertaking.
Did you seal the holes?
Yes, they were sealed, right. They made sure that those were sealed and then epoxy covered, and so that part has remained. Those particular openings are no longer have an impact on the ship itself. So that was a major concern at that time. So the concretion contains other materials. Somebody suggested at one time, well, what about rare earths? Maybe there's some real interesting material that comes out of that, but we haven't been able to identify that. So that's not really what we've been most concerned about is the iron accumulation and then relating that back to the condition of the ship. I'm still having trouble. I'm on a project that I've been involved with the Coast Guard Academy, and they've just conducted research on a ship that was sunk off the Atlantic coast by a German submarine, and I wanted them to collect the concretion to go along with the metal sample, but they said, no, we just cleaned up that metal sample, you know. We cleaned it up so you'd have a nice pretty piece of metal to work with. Well, we lost half the information we need, so I'm still having trouble trying to make people understand that concretion can be important, and here it is right here. This happens to be evidence of a bomb impact, at least that's what we think, that there were bottom sands that were impacted against the hull of the ship. And you can see the yellow strip here represents one component of the silicon, and the other one on the right side is the aluminum component. And when you put those two together, it's just ordinary aluminum oxide, which is just a typical component in sand. And so the thought was, well, if this is true, if this is, and we've identified these by characterization techniques, that one is silicon, the other is aluminum, the metallic form, that where did that come from? Well, it came from the bottom sands because we had the Park Service collect some bottom sand for us, and we analyzed it and had the same analysis as this. So this has been a way that we've used the concretion as a way to identify an historical event. And we've since now developed modeling from this and done some other things which we hope we can get published that might tell us a little bit more about how the rate of corrosion is being impacted by early stage versus long stage corrosion. So that's just another part of it. But anyway, the concretion can be an interesting part of our studies. Now, to get on to finite element analysis, this is a technique that uses a computer to construct the ship in such a way that it can then interpret loads that are on the ship and then give us an understanding of how long that structure is going to remain together. So this particular study, finite element analysis, conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Maryland, has been conducted. They've been working on this for probably 10 years, and they have some interesting results. This happens to be a cross-section of the ship showing a section of the ship between frame 90, I think this frame 70 and 90. So frame 70 on the bow side and 90 towards the stern. That part of the ship has been reconstructed, and this is the buildup of this finite element model. And the next slide here shows us the as-built condition. There's no load. It's just a picture of the structure the way they did it electronically, which would be beyond me. I would know how they in the world they did this, but it's really been a very useful technique. And what they've done then, in this particular case, this is just the self-weights, and you'll see that the blue color and the green represent very low stress. And there's no red or yellow or in these photographs, and this is just the weight of the ship itself. So what happens now is, in this particular drawing, they've taken the results that we have done from our corrosion measurements and knowing how much metal is left. So this one happens to be 60% thickness loss, and this is about 2180. This is the 2180, so that's you know, we're estimating maybe 150 years, 175 years, somewhere in that range, that things really become very serious. Considerable upper deck failures. You can see the reds and the yellows. Failure of some of the inner walls, and failures at the turn of the bilge at the bottom, and that's where the oil is. So the estimate is that this provides the Park Service with some feel for what's going to happen over a period of time. There's many, many of these. I only wanted to show you one. There's one other one which goes out about 300 years, and the whole structure is beginning to fly apart, and the only thing that's left is the core in the middle. And at that time, of course, by that time, the oil is long since gone. Well, that gives us, the Park Service, at least a long-term management plan. Significant structural change is not imminent right now. The status quo regarding intervention and oil removal. Maybe things have changed a little bit since this slide was produced, but generally that's about it. Oil containment and boom and diversion alternatives. The idea is not to conduct any kind of research or try to remove the oil. Those are not practical issues. Doing what we call cathodic protection to try to minimize the rate of corrosion is not even considered. It's a very expensive process. Our purpose and the purpose of NIST is primarily what's the state of the ship at a given time, so that the Park Service and the Navy then have some criteria upon which to plan for the future. So that's been the primary impact of our work. Now, follow-on investigations, it turns out some of the information like the concretion analysis and some other things we've done have been useful to project into other kinds of ship losses, and so there are several of these. We were involved a little bit in the Hunley. When that first developed in Charleston, South Carolina, the Hunley was a Confederate submarine that was recovered in 2000, in the year 2000. We've done some work on the Japanese midget submarine, the John Paul Jones frigate on the English coast. That was kind of an interesting project, and maybe I need to be getting along with this, but at the time we did our analysis, one of the divers, I think it was Dr. Dave Conlon, went over to England and took out a sample of the metal that they used to sheet over the wood to protect worm infestation. Well, they did the analysis, we did the analysis, and found out that it was brass. It was an alloy of copper and zinc, whereas that had not been developed during the John Paul Jones time period. So if it were copper, we could identify it perhaps as the John Paul Jones frigate, but the people that were on the East Coast in this city said, no, that was the John Paul frigate, and this town, a really important issue is that, you know, when tourists come around, that we can show them the remains of the ship. But it turns out we provided a little bit of disappointment there, although I was told not to really to publish that or say too much about it. So we have, so we just kind of let the thing go, you know, didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. We've done the Monitor, the Submarine Explorer. I'll just go through some of these. I won't go through all of them. One of our important associations the past 4 years have been with the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. And that has really been an interesting project. And working with the Coast Guard, of course, they're responsible for these ships that are out in that are sunken off the coasts of the west and east coast of the United States. So the Coast Guard Academy has developed a laboratory, corrosion laboratory, and is just carrying on some of the work that we've got started. Our two latest projects are the Coast Trader and the Prince Eugen. Now the Prince Eugen is an interesting situation. I can remember in World War II, I was in high school at Wheat Ridge, and I often listened to the radio. And I remember hearing about the Prince Eugen and the Bismarck breaking out into the open ocean, and I believe it was, you know, the open ocean on the western side of the Iceland. And I remember that the British had sunk the Bismarck, but the Prince Eugen got away. Well, it turns out the Prince Eugen now, after the war, and of course it had been involved in many battles and was very successful as a, of course, as a heavy cruiser during World War II. But it turns out after the war, it was turned over to the United States, and the United States transported it over to the Bikini Atoll, and it was involved in the Bikini atom bomb tests. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Anyway, keep going here. I just wanted to present this, and this is the only one that's kind of a technical plot, but I just wanted to show that what we have here is what I call a relative corrosion rate is this WN. It's named after a gentleman that I worked with at the University of Nebraska who passed away, and we call it the Wines number, and it's a plot of and it's a relative corrosion rate, so it has to do with the rate of corrosion on the vertical scale, and the horizontal scale is the temperature. So you see we have Arizona up there at the top along with Prince Eugen. The Prince Eugen lies upside down in the Kwajalein atolls right now. After the Bikini test, it was told to Kwajalein, and then they had some kind of a valve problem that leaked or something, and the ship turned over. So the Prince Eugen is inverted in the Kwajalein atolls, and the U.S. Navy Sea System Command has just been over there in May and did some research on it, and so we've been involved in metallurgical work on that. And several other projects, the Submarine Explorer and so on, other shipwrecks, and on down to the one on the right, we got a little teeny tiny piece of concretion, or what they call incrustation off of the Titanic. And we analyzed that in our laboratory and decided, well, okay, we'll go ahead and put that on the plot just to show us about what the extremes are. So we're talking about temperatures on the vertical scale up there. The Arizona is around 30 degrees centigrade, and that's along with the Prince Eugen. And as we go down through that list, we see at the very bottom the Titanic in water that's at around 2 degrees centigrade, or I guess it's around 35, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's a big range from about 85 degrees down to close to 35 degrees or so. So we have quite a long range, and we've been able to tie together from work we did on Arizona to other shipwrecks. So it's kind of the attempt has been to try to do a correlation so we can relate one to the other. Anyway, I better get going with this. The Japanese submarine, midget submarine, we did 2 of those. It was sunk in December 7th, 41, of course. And this is the submersible used by the University of Hawaii. And pilot Terry Kirby had found the submarine I-20, it was I-16A. He discovered it. There was John Ballard, you know, the famous explorer who discovered the Titanic, had been out in the area off Pearl Harbor on the south, on the south side of Pearl Harbor, and in Oahu, off Oahu. He was unable to find it, but Terry found it, and subsequently, then we were able to recover samples. So this is the USS Ward gun crew that sunk the I-20A. That's, I said 16A, I meant the 20A. And this was the first shot in World War II, and that's the entry of a shell into the conning tower of the Japanese midget submarine. And I believe that's what's probably caused problems inside, and eventually the submarine then sank in about 1,000 feet of water. This happens to be then the ROV up, or the submersible right next to it, and you see the baskets on the bottom side there were samples that were collected for us to do analysis on, and you can see just the evidence of the impact right there. So that was considered to be the first shot of World War II in the Pacific. Oh, well, go back to this one. That's just the rear end of the I-16A where the samples were taken. The USS Monitor, we've done some work for those people at the Mariners Museum in Virginia. That's really been, was an interesting trip that we made to try to correlate some of the work we've done with the turret that was recovered and has since been treated at the Mariners Museum. So we had several samples that we took from the concretion samples and metal samples that we took from that project as well. And that's part of that curve that I showed you earlier, the temperature curve. So we've been able to incorporate the results of that into our research. And that, of course, is the typical, I believe, go back to this one, the Monitor and the revolving turret. I believe there's a picture of you with that. I think there was a picture of yourself with that on the Monitor, right? You were standing on board, right? Right. Oh, there he was there. Okay. Well, I'm not going to say much more about that, because anyway, now the next thing we did was a Civil War era submarine explorer. This was constructed and built and designed by a German engineer, and he wanted to sell this idea to the Navy. It would be a platform for demolitions. Well, the war came to an end, and he failed on that issue to get the Navy to accept it. But anyway, it was purchased by a group that used it as a way to mine for pearls down in the Bay of Panama. And that turned out to be successful for maybe a couple of years, but at that time they didn't know or realize the problem of the bends. In other words, they went down 100 feet, and then of course this was the first submarine to have what is called pressure compensation, I believe, at least one of the earlier ones, where they had a pressure tank, and then the pressure would compensate for the pressure of the water, so the divers could go off the bottom and mine for pearls, and then take them back into the platform, which was the submarine, bring them to the surface. But they were not able to. That was not successful. The entire group, I believe, eventually lost their lives over the fact that, because of the bends issue at that time. This is a picture of the submarine as it sits off St. Elmo's Island, and this is from the seaside. There's been a lot of corrosion, of course, and I think one of the issues with that is there have been a lot of impacts of logs and just other debris that has struck the seaside of the submarine. This submarine is constructed of wrought iron and cast iron. It's a huge, massive piece of machinery, and kind of interesting. They lifted me up and put me down inside there, and it's kind of interesting to be inside a submarine and realize what these people were up against at that time. I'm doing a little bit of analysis on it. This is in the Bay of Panama, about 70 miles southwest of Panama City. It took us several hours to get out there. And this is, of course, Panama, return to Panama City. The SS Montebello was another ship that we were engaged in. It turns out that something I didn't realize, but there were something like 14 ships were sunk by Japanese submarines off the west coast of the United States during World War II. That's the number that I saw, and this happens to be one of them. It was sunk by a Japanese submarine I-21 just a few days after Pearl Harbor attack. And so the NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, commandeered a ship, and they went out and did some wonderful work in bringing up samples for us, as well as for the other work that they were doing. And we were able then to obtain quite a bit of information about that one, and that's part of our results to date. So that's the tanker, and that is a photograph of the explosion, at least not a photograph, but a painting, and sunk by I-21 on December 23rd, 41. This happens to be some pictures of onboard ship, the sample on the left, and a person by the name of Robert Schemmer is a person at NOAA that's involved directly in shipwreck analysis, was out on board the ship for us. That happened to be one of the core samples taken out of the ship, so that was probably one of the most successful operations that we've seen. But again, they were very proud of the fact that they cleaned up the sample. You know, oh yeah, they took the concretion sample off of it, so there we were again. We had one little piece of concretion to work with, but we have to struggle with what we're happy to get what we can. This is a coast trader. This is a freighter that was built in 1937. This happens, well, it was built before 37. This happened to be a picture of the ship in San Francisco, and they were, this ship was in off the coast of Juan de Fuca Straits, and between Canada and United States. And it turns out that this submarine, I-26, sank the coast trader, and I was out at Seattle during the time that they did this a year ago in June of 2016. They went down and viewed the ship and took a few samples. And this happens to be a picture. The ship is sitting upright, and you can see a ladder just on the left-hand side there to identify this as the ship's surface. And they did identify it as the coast trader as a survey. Now, this is only in the beginning stages. We hope that they can go back on this and take more samples so that we have more basis to work with. Now, the last ship that I'll talk about is the Prince Eugen. This happens to be a picture of the ship in the Baltic Sea in 1941. It's a heavy cruiser. I think it was over 600 feet long, entirely welded structure. The Arizona was riveted, and that has always been a concern to those that are doing corrosion research. How does the rivets have an impact on the corrosion rate of the ship? In other words, what they found on the Titanic was that they think that the rivets began to give way, and that's what created the problem with the Titanic initially. So the thought has been that the rivets may be a problem on Arizona. But in the case of the Prince Eugen, entirely welded ship, so they had the technology way back to conduct welding as opposed to riveting, and that had a major impact on the length of the time of the ship. Well, this is the atom bomb test, the Bikini Atoll in 1946. I was in the Navy just at the very end of World War II, and I remember that I was, before I was discharged in July of 46, I was offered the opportunity to participate in the Bikini Atoll test. And, and I'm glad I didn't, for a variety of reasons. Now, the Prince Eugen is one of the ships on the right-hand side of that explosion. And now the reason I didn't, I'm glad I never did, because these are sailors that are swabbing the ship, the Prince Eugen, after the atom test. And
To see if they can
that
clean it.
doesn't look like, pardon?
To see if they can clean it.
Yeah, see if they can clean it. But I think that was, I was just as glad that I went ahead and was discharged in July of 46 and didn't participate in that. So that's the Prince Eugen then is upside down in the Kwajalein Atolls. That's in the it's the Marshall Islands. Republic of the Marshall Islands is now owns that ship. There's a runway there, and then the Prince Eugen, I think, is located up in this area. So that is something that we're just, turns out that they did the work in May. We got 2 samples just delivered, I think, the day before yesterday, that we're going to analyze at the at South Dakota School of Mines and Technology and at the University of Nebraska. We're hoping now to get more information as it trickles in. We've had to wait for a couple of months for those samples. So anyway, we're very fortunate to be involved in these projects and try to help out in whatever way we can. These happen to be pictures of the Navy Sea Systems Command in May getting ready to do their dives on the Prince Eugen. So that was quite a project. Oil bunkers on the Prince Eugen, they're concerned about a lot of tonnage, yes.
Can I ask a quick question? On Kwajalein, I've been to Kwajalein.
Uh-huh.
It was off limits for the Marshallese. Is it still that case for the U.S.? We have the satellite tracking stuff like that. Is it still the case? You know?
I just don't know. I don't have any idea. I know that they had to get permission from now, it's the Republic of the Marshall Islands, so they are completely in charge of what these people can do, but I presume that they have had the rights to do this, and I don't know, I don't know how that's related. I think there was quite a long discussion about this in the report that I just had, and I didn't really delve into that, but I think the legal issues are still prevalent, dominant in doing this kind of activity. The ship is again lying upside down and that's just a picture from the surface. That's from outer space, or that's from the air looking down on it. Anyway, again, we're using this plot. I'm just using this plot to kind of identify the various locations of the structures, and we don't have the Prince Eugen directly involved in this, or we do have the temperature involved, and we hope that we can get more information about these. This plot is about 90% confidence level, so it has been pretty good, and we're pleased with anybody that can provide more information for us. We're ready to take it. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I wanted to say that we have to acknowledge so many different entities from the National Park Service, DOD, the University of Nebraska contributed to this, NOAA, the Naval Sea Systems Command right now. So there's been a variety of people who are involved in this. As far as I'm concerned, a lot of my time is volunteer time, although I'm provided with expenses and things like that when I make trips and do an occasional publication. We've published about I don't know, 10 or 12 articles now about our work that's in the open literature. And so with time, maybe we'll be able to interest more people in what we're doing and try to put it all together and have some better answers for the concern that people have about what about the oil ingress. You know, that's the concern on Prince Eugen. There's something like 86,000, I don't know what it is, barrels of fuel oil still might be on board. And so the Republic of the Marshall Islands is concerned about what is the oil impact, what are the navigation impacts. So that's kind of the concern and the reason that we've been going into some of these issues. The other issue probably is just archaeological. You know, we want to know, the people want to know, and we work with the archaeologists. So that's been really an interesting thing. And you'll find that archaeology is just the most interdisciplinary, because there's so many different types of discipline that are involved in archaeology. And I'm not an archaeologist, but I like to work with them, and we work back and forth and try to understand each other better. And they understand us, and we understand their lingo, you know, so it kind of works both ways. Anyway, thank you very much. Maybe a few moments for questions. Yes.
With global warming, are you taking impact, are you looking into that impact?
Well, we really can't tell. You know, it turns out that when we obtain a temperature, it's going to be a temperature at the time that they did this. For example, on the Prince Eugen, they gave me a temperature of 85 degrees. Well, that's in May of this year. Now, what would be the temperature, say, in a structure in December or some other? So it's a seasonal issue. And as far as the temperature changes or the impact of global warming, we would not be able to make any discernment out of differences, because those numbers are so small compared to what variation we see from season to season. So we don't have really a way to do that. Yes.
Just two quick questions on oil. Why maybe I missed it? Why don't they take the oil out of Arizona?
Okay. I'd like to.
Second question is, why in the world would they leave the oil in the Prince Eugen if they're going to?
They're not planning to leave. Yeah, that's an issue. Now that's a good question, because it relates to my answer. In the case of the Arizona, it's impossible to go in there and do hot tapping or whatever, just because of the cultural impact, the people visiting and so on. And the fact that the oil is distributed all through the ship in different compartments. So where they go in and they try to do a hot tapping here, what are they going to impact? Are they going to cause leaking of oil, you know, secondarily? And so the whole issue is it just would be impossible to do that in Pearl Harbor. So that is not even a consideration. What they're thinking is maybe the oil would naturally degrade over time. The amount of leaking is minimal. That has no impact. The other issue is maybe using some kind of bacterial activity that would degrade the oil, similar to what nature has done down in the Gulf of Mexico over a period of time. Now on Prince Eugen, it's a very different situation. What they did in December of 16, they went into the Prince Eugen on a survey, and they found out that they thought at the time, just looking at it, that there wasn't enough metal there they could really, you know, attach equipment to do the drilling. There wasn't enough structure there to conduct hot tapping. Well, then they went out in May, and we thought that this may not be the case, because what we found on Arizona is, so you see a lot of metal left. They went out there in May of this year and found out, yes, they could do hot tapping. That a major part of the metal is still left on Prince Eugen, particularly at depth. And that's part of the plan that's coming up now is to do hot tapping on that oil. In fact, they've been even looking at the expenses and what it might cost to extract the oil and what they might be able to sell the oil for and ship it to Singapore. But when they consider the cost of shipping and the cost of extraction, it looked like they weren't going to make any money on the deal. So I don't know. That's kind of open. That question ties those two together.
Follow up. Why in the world would the U.S. government put all that oil on that ship before, when they knew they were subject?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it had to do with the Bikini Atoll test and wanted to see what the impact of oil was, because it was, I don't know what, it was pretty high capacity oil at the time. So that may have been part of it, you know. I just don't know. Yes.
Do you know if, did they do that with other ships? If they were part of that test, like the Saratoga, stuff like that?
On the case of the Montebello, we did the metallurgical part of it, but it turns out that they couldn't find any oil. I mean, they ended up with, you know, 75,000 barrels of oil were contained in the ship when they were shipping the oil from, I think from, let's see, I think they were going from, maybe they're going from Union Oil Company tanker is what it was, shipping oil up to the north for refining. And so that they just didn't proceed, weren't able to find any oil on board, I guess. And we, when we got our samples, we could tell there was a little bit of oil smell, you know, in the sample itself, but no particular issue. Some of the other ships that we've seen, there was another couple of ships off the East Coast that we did analysis on, but there was no oil involved. In fact, one of them, it was called the USS Paraguay, was used as a bombing target just, I think, after World War I, where they were, you know, testing, determining accuracy of aerial bombing and impact on ships from aerial. That's back in the time when they were talking about, you know, aerial impacts on ships and how efficient that was compared to the battleship. So that was a big argument back in those days, you know, the battleship versus the aircraft carrier and the airborne impacts on ships. Other questions? Yes.
It seemed like from your chart that the amount of oxygen in the water was more important to how well it held up than the temperature. Is that correct?
It was a combination of both. It turns out the Wines number is based on the actual corrosion rate relative to theoretical corrosion rate based on the ingress or the diffusion of oxygen through that concretion layer. And so it determined both the temperature, the thickness of that layer, as well as the oxygen content, the normal oxygen content in the oil. So that determined how much oxygen could get through. So we've kind of based the wines, what I call WN is really a Wines number, and it's just a ratio of, it's what I call a dimensionless ratio. And that's exactly what we've been doing. You know, we correlate the temperature and the oxygen. Good question, thank you. Yes?
Isn't part of the reason that the Huntley survived so well is because it was completely covered in mud for most of the time?
I think that was, yes, that was certainly a big issue because so much of that metal was left, you know. That structure was, it's amazing how, I don't know what this, I think they're through with the pre-treatment now. Yeah. I think they're ready to, maybe they're, at the time, we were there for the first kind of conference that they had prior to lifting the ship. And one of the issues was they were going to construct a new facility there at the museum in Charleston. And then, so I don't know just where the state of that is right now, but that's certainly on its way. That was an interesting we had people from Australia as well as ourselves. We were just getting involved in it, and the people from Australia have been involved in this for many years, so they were really very important part of that component. And we were just in the learning stage, so we learned a lot just being able to listen to people and what was going on at that time, and that was 1999. Other questions? Any other questions you have, why, please feel free. Thank you.
Before we leave, I want to make sure that I present to Don our Museum Challenge coin.
Oh, wow,
for his
thank you.
presentation today. And Don, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
And
it.
thank you guys for coming. And feel free to hang around and ask Don any questions, and then look at our new exhibits and displays that we've worked so hard on lately. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.